Hello, it's Anna Beckwith from Never Mind the Buzzwords here, with the second in our series on culture. Today I'm going to be talking about subculture. As I mentioned last time, we've been doing quite a lot of work recently with a range of clients looking at organisational culture and how and where and why they might want to change some aspects of their current corporate culture. Now, in that part of our work, or as part of that, we were looking into subculture and researching it in a general sense. And a lot of the information that comes up online is actually about subculture in a very, very general sense. So there's a lot of information about music subcultures or youth subcultures. So I've got quite a lot of information about goths, for example, and skateboarders. Now, at first I was thinking, well, interesting, but not particularly relevant in the context of business subcultures. But actually, it kind of is, in its way. So if you remember in the first clip where we looked at organisational culture in a fairly generic sense, we looked also at country culture, at national culture. Actually, in the same way, looking at youth subcultures and how they work can actually be quite informative when it comes to looking at subcultures within your own organisation. So let's take skateboarders as an example. What makes them a subculture? Well, they are part of mainstream culture because by and large they're still doing a lot of things that everybody else does in the broader community. What makes it a subculture is perhaps things to do with the way in which they choose to present themselves and the clothes that they choose to wear. In some respects, the terminology and the vocabulary and the language that has developed around that particular activity, and of course what they choose to actually do in their spare time. Skateboard, obviously enough. So a number of factors make them different from the mainstream and therefore a subculture. It's also important to point out that a subculture still involves a group of individuals. It's not just one person with a group of people rallying around them as followers. This is a group of people who define themselves as a collective in a way that is slightly different from the mainstream. So where does this put us with regard to business subcultures? Well, perhaps the critical thing here with any organisation is to acknowledge that there will be subcultures within an organisation. Obviously enough, if it's a global organisation, there will inevitably be subcultures because the way things happen in the Indian office, for example, is going to be very different from the way in which things happen in the London office or the New York office because there are differences in national culture. There will also be subcultures and cultural differences even within a smaller organisation based within a single country because the way in which things are done, for example, in the marketing department might be very, very different from the way in which people in the finance department work or the IT department and so forth. The crucial question is this: what are those core values? What is the core culture that can and must exist across the whole organisation as a standard, and what are the allowable subcultures? Because there must and there will be subcultures. It isn't like Attack of the Clones. Everybody is not going to do everything in exactly the same way. But there does have to be a benchmark of what are those core values, what is the core culture that the company actually wants to espouse and wants to build. Perhaps then the question then becomes, if we have allowable subcultures, what happens when a subculture is actually not particularly helpful and is breaking away a little bit too much, perhaps is behaving in a way that is obviously at odds with the main corporate culture? In these instances, I would suggest this is where the main corporate culture has to be very, very clear. Not only does it have to be clear, something has to be actually happening to make sure that it is actually being lived, the values are being lived. I said in the first clip in this series that culture isn't just what you say it is, it's what it is. So if you have a subculture that is not helpful and there's something there that needs to be changed, in terms of unhelpful behaviours and approaches and so forth, the benchmark has to be the company's overall culture, the company's overall values. And it's no good just talking about those. Those values and that culture has to be role modelled by senior people in the organisation. Appropriate behaviours within that culture have to be rewarded And also, it has to be built into some sort of behavioural competency framework so that those behaviours and those values are actually measured. It's not just what you say it is, it's what it actually is. It's what's actually happening at the coalface. In that instance, if you have a very clear set of organisational values and a very clearly defined organisational culture, it's easier to use that as a benchmark to address subcultures which are not particularly helpful. Not to stamp them out and erase them altogether, because remember, you still have those allowable differences, but to ensure that subcultures within the organisation do not detract from the overall cultural values that the organisation is seeking to put forward and is seeking to live by.